Hello, class. Today I'm going to talk and develop a little bit more my discussion about the Comanche and the Anglo empires and this clash, you might say, of very, very different, pardon me, civilizations in Texas anyway, between the 1820s and the 1870s when the Comanche were finally suppressed and forced to move into Oklahoma. As I developed earlier this week, this idea that the Comanches had their own empire, which you can see if you have a screen you're in front of you, which covered northwest Texas, eastern New Mexico, a good bit of Oklahoma, most of Oklahoma, about 2/3, and southern Kansas. And the Comanches were very aware of the boundaries of their empire. They didn't have maps or anything. They had what they would look at is natural spots. They were very keen observers of the natural world. And so they knew what the bounds of the Comancheria were. And if you remember, we first ran into the Comanche in the 1700s when they came into North Texas. They fought the Apache. Luckily for the Spanish, San Antonio was just east of the Comancheria. Otherwise, the Comanche would have driven the Spanish out of Texas. They could have done it in an afternoon if they'd cared to, but they didn't care to because San Antonio was just south of the area that they considered their home. To jump into the 1800s, the reason that the folks coming into Texas, the Anglo-Americans with their slaves, the reason that the Comanche aren't really hassling them is most of those folks settled in East Texas. And occasionally a Comanche would go into East Texas, but on the whole, where the Anglo settlers and slaves settled were outside the Comancheria, which was lucky for them because again, at this point, the Comanche were much stronger than they were. And just to note something that's obvious, but I'll say it anyway, the Comanches were no respecters of Spanish borders or Mexican borders or U.S. borders. European or American borders meant nothing to them. The Comanches had their own sense of borders, and the Comanche were a proud and very fierce empire. So the Comanche don't hassle the settlers coming into Texas beginning in the 1820s. They don't hassle them because they're afraid of them. They don't hassle them because those Anglo settlers and their slaves are out of the Comancheria. Now, this begins to change in the 1830s as folks such as the Parker family, Cynthia and Parker, move into the eastern fringes of the Comancheria. And so what we have beginning in the 1830s, as Anglos are moving into what the Comanche perceive as their territory, what happens is basically it's a guerrilla warfare that continues almost for 40 years. And if you look at the Comancheria, it's quite amazing how large it is territorially. It's a big chunk of North America. Okay, so the Comanche, just a quick review, we ran into them during the Spanish period. They gave the Spanish more than they could handle. Ultimately, what the Spanish do is, in effect, they kind of bribe the Comanche. They pay them off with all kinds of gifts, pots and pans, and guns. Well, guns occasionally. Tools that the Comanche couldn't make on their own because the Comanche were not an industrial society. They were a nomadic society. So the Treaty of 1785, signed by the Spanish and the Comanche, basically the Comanche agreed not to raid Spanish settlements as long as they got their annual gifts, as long as they received their annual gifts. And this worked surprisingly well. But in the 1820s, Spain is kicked out of North America, and the Mexican nation comes online. And sadly for the Mexicans, who have just a huge problem, one of the issues that Mexico faced generally, not just in Texas, was this underpopulation. There are only 6 million Mexicans all the way from South Mexico into Northern California. One of the many, many headaches the Mexicans faced was the Comanche. The Mexican government did not have the resources to offer the kind of gifts that the Comanche had come to expect. And so beginning in the 1820s, the Comanche start going wild again because they're not getting the gifts that they had been promised. This is one of the things that Tourget brings out in his book. It's one of the reasons that the Spanish and especially the Mexican governments opened the door to immigration from the United States, because what they're trying to do in part, they're trying to do a lot of things, but in terms of bringing more people into this territory. But what they're trying to do in part is to bring a bigger population into Texas to serve as kind of a buffer between the Comanches and Mexico, and also to have more bodies in Texas to fight the Comanche. So this is one of the reasons that the Mexicans opened the door to Texas for Americans. Although, as you should know by now, the Mexican government soon regrets this decision. So the Comanches are wreaking havoc in the 1820s, especially when the Mexican Republic can't offer them the gifts that they're expecting. The other thing is the Comanches would raid deep into what's now northern Mexico, northeastern Mexico, hundreds of miles south of the Rio Grande. It's just incredible the distance the Comanche would travel. Often they would attack during the fall. This was a time of real terror if you lived in this part of Mexico. And the reason that they're going into that part of North America instead of into the settlements of East Texas, where Anglos are, Texas is still relatively underpopulated, and it's not really that wealthy. And so what the Comanches are doing is they're going where the resources are, where there's more horses, where there's more loot. And so they would come from Oklahoma, North Texas, Kansas, cross the Rio Grande at Big Bend country, and attack deep into northern Mexico. It's extraordinary, their range of the Comanche. And every year the Comanche would bring together hundreds and hundreds of Indian warriors to invade into northern Mexico. And this is one of the reasons that Mexico is very weak, especially in its north, because it's constantly facing these Comanche raids, which every year hundreds of Mexicans are dying, and dozens and dozens and dozens, if not more, Mexican children are being kidnapped by the Comanche. So it was really, really rough to be in northern Mexico during this period. Extraordinarily violent, tremendous upheaval during this period. Okay, so this idea of the class of civilizations, you've got the Comanche civilization on one hand, and increasingly coming in from the east, the civilization, Anglo-American civilization, or civilization dominated by Anglo-Americans, that by the 1830s, but especially in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, are starting to encroach from East Texas into the Comancheria, which is going to generate a very, very powerful response on the part of the Comanche.